Hello dear viewers of my channel, this is a new part of your favorite manhwa. Enjoy the video. In the evening at the main character's estate, the queen sat at the table and stared intently ahead, while Lloyd's parents seemed to be beyond excited. They were pouring in their own sweat. Lloyd himself was in such a state for the first time in his life. He seemed incapable of saying a word, while the queen sipped her tea in silence and seemed completely calm. She began to tell that the tea was really delicious, and asked where her new mother had gotten the leaves. Such words shocked the poor girl, who still couldn't believe that the queen was her son's wife. She began to shout with all her might that she had not stolen the tea leaves, while her husband tried to calm her down, for she was talking a lot of nonsense because of her excitement. The man himself started shouting that he was the person who stole the tea leaves. The protagonist asked his parents to calm down and began to say that he would tell everything, after which the queen made a gloomy look and asked if Lloyd was going to tell about how he tricked the queen into agreeing to the marriage. Parents turned pale with fear. After the words that the girl said, they silently fainted, for such words meant that this was the day when they would be finished. The protagonist began to say that his parents would calm down, and then began to confess that the engagement was just a pretext. The parents fell out of the world again, unable to react in any way, while Lloyd looked at Xavier and mentally questioned what he had come up with in bringing the queen to his house. Xavier looked at his lord carefully, seeming to understand his worries, and then turned away indifferently, making Lloyd even more worried, for he could not understand what was going on. While the queen said that enough jokes from now on, and said that she would tell the whole truth, the parents listened attentively to the story that Lloyd had to take away one treasure of their empire, which was a gift from the holy dragon. And then the queen told that the dragon met the hero and asked him how he dared to have this treasure, because he was not of royal blood. Then the parents heard the words that Lloyd had lied about being the queen's husband and that he belonged to the royal family. The parents of the protagonist seemed to fall out of this world. They were in a distant space, thinking that after the explanation became much worse. The queen began to say that Lloyd needed to answer for lying to the most holy dragon, while the father of the protagonist realized that a terrible punishment was about to await them all. He began to shake and say that for such a transgression, they cannot atone even by death. While the queen looked at the man with a cold-blooded look, the protagonist also looked at his father, who instantly fell to his knees and began to say that Lloyd is dear to him as a son, and began to beg not to kill the guy. Lloyd was shocked by these words and didn't understand what was going on. While his mother began to beg the queen for mercy for the protagonist, Lloyd instantly started running to his parents, screaming for them to stop. He started telling the queen that it wasn't his parents' fault and he alone should be punished for his actions. The father started yelling at his son, saying that the parents should be responsible for the misdeeds of their children, while Lloyd didn't understand this, and then he was about to tell them that he was not the son of these people, when suddenly the queen started talking about being stuffy, and added that she had heard that Lloyd was mentally broken, and then she started smiling because as soon as there is a challenge, he starts fighting again to the end. Lloyd listened attentively to the queen's words that she wasn't going to kill him, and then she was silent for a while. Then looking Lloyd straight in the eye, she said that she wanted to make their engagement real. Lloyd couldn't fully comprehend the words he had just heard. And then with the stupidest face he could make in this situation, he asked her what she had said. She immediately slapped the stupid guy with anger and then repeated that she wanted Lloyd to be her husband and part of the royal family. The parents heard the queen ask Lloyd to work with her for the kingdom, while the protagonist refused the offer with the most indifferent look. The parents were shocked by their son's refusal and listened to them and the queen arguing about it. But in the end the girl sighed and suggested a compromise. She told them about the angel who had ordered them to give the Eye of the Summer to Lloyd, and that two groups of counselors had formed, those who were against it and those who were in favor of giving the eye. Lloyd didn't understand what was going on, because he had nothing to do with the angel doing something like that. Xavier stood silently looking at the uncomprehending protagonist, and then he turned away, pretending he didn't care what was going on. The protagonist didn't know what to say, because he didn't see a way out and just kept falling deeper and deeper. Lloyd thought about the fact that he should have looked for a solution because he just had to cope. The protagonist thought that he was not the only one who had to do something. Then he found himself together with his loved ones and realized that only with their help he could do something. The queen looked carefully towards Lloyd, waiting for his answer, while the protagonist with the most confident look declared that he would calm all the chaos. The boys set off towards the dragon, to return to the queen's house. The protagonist thought that there must be a solution to the problem, and that he should take care of his health first. The boy looked back at his parents, who were very happy that their son was finally back to normal, while on Lloyd's face there was sadness that he was not the native son of these good people. The protagonist began to smile, thinking that he would protect his new mother and father, while the queen also turned towards Lloyd's parents, They didn't seem to understand why this was happening, and a moment later their faces were frozen in shock at what they saw in front of them. The queen herself bowed to them to show them her respect, and she quietly said that they would see each other again very soon, addressing them as father and mother. This surprised the poor parents very much, while the protagonist seemed not to feel very well. As the palace was filled with unbelievable screams, people began to fight among themselves. They were very angry because they had different opinions. Suddenly the doors to the council chamber opened with great force. The protagonist in his manner announced that the culprit of all their troubles had arrived on the scene. A little while later, on a clear day in the castle, Lloyd was sitting on a chair in a dark room, and seemed to be waiting for something, when suddenly there was a light that fell on the guy's body, after which the man announced that at this very moment an emergency meeting of the council begins, and that they will decide whether they should fulfill the will of the heavens. Count Altaz raised his hand and was then given the floor, whereupon the man announced that they had missed the clause in the title of the meeting that they would decide the fate of the Eye of Summer. While another counselor sat there not knowing what to say, he repeated the same thing but added the subject of the Eye of Summer to the whole thing. One of the counselors started to shout that this was nonsense, but he was interrupted saying that he could only speak after raising his hand. He did so and then started talking about how they were just wasting their time trying to name this meeting. He started yelling that their meeting should definitely include the word great, while the counselor changed the title again. One of the counselors started yelling at the others, for it really was a waste of time. While the others yelled that their meeting should have a decent title, they continued to bicker amongst themselves with no chance of finding a solution to the dispute. The protagonist, on the other hand, felt this silly atmosphere and thought about the fact that part of something like this was native to him, whereupon a smile appeared on his face and he was about to start processing these counselors. After a while, it was deep into the night, the counselor started saying an incredibly long name, which told me that they were still only concerned with picking a name. One of the men started shouting that they had to fulfill the angel's message, because it was mandatory. He continued to shout that the right thing to do was to follow the will of heaven. One of the advisors turned to the protagonist, asking if there were any guarantees that Lloyd would not use the artifact for his own good. The protagonist began to say that he, as a loyal servant of the queen, would not dare abuse the relic. Then the protagonist began to say that if the neighboring countries attacked, he would not be able to accept it. The advisors began to leave, thinking that everything was solved, while Lloyd began to shake and talk about the fact that he has a huge responsibility, because if they oppose the will of heaven, they will be unhappy. All the counselors started shouting for Lloyd to make his decision, while the guy started shouting that he just can't make such hard decisions and that he won't do it. A moment later the counselors started fighting each other with all their might. Then Lloyd said that he had a great idea. All the counselors instantly turned their attention to the guy. The protagonist started talking about how the angelic message has unknown risks, while the loss of the artifact is a specific threat. Then he said that the loss of such an item is tantamount to weakening the country. The protagonist started talking about how if he had another artifact that could replace the Eye of Summer, everything would be easier. All the advisors listened attentively to what Lloyd had to say next. The protagonist told about the mountain range which was on the border of the kingdom, and it was very difficult to trade with other countries. Because of it they had to make a huge detour. The protagonist announced that they were very helpful to small countries because of it. Then Lloyd said that he could build a trade route through the ridge. The protagonist began to talk about how their kingdom would gain incredible wealth. All the advisors accused the hero of trading on royal honor. They began to listen intently about the vast amount of money that would flow to them. Then with an incredibly greedy look he said that the advisors could get their share of the profits as well. The counselors were instantly confused and excited about the new opportunity. Moments later the man announced that the council unanimously confirmed the transfer of the Eye of Summer to the protagonist. Lloyd was pleased that he had gotten what he wanted so easily, while Xavier remarked that he got the feeling that Lloyd knew politics better than construction. The protagonist started talking about how it's normal for politicians to be in a fight, but as soon as they make a profit, they instantly become best friends. Xavier starts talking about how money is always connected to power. A little while later Lloyd arrived at the queen, who gave the go-ahead for the construction, and the boy thanked the girl. The queen didn't understand how this was possible, as they had been trying to build a trade route since ancient times. But because of the harsh conditions, everything was in vain. The queen also began to say that it would be very difficult to go that way, while the protagonist began to say that they would use the railroad, which would allow them to transport goods perfectly. The protagonist remembered that in his world they also used the mechanics that Lloyd was going to use. He imagined the train moving down the mountain and how it could change its motion. The queen began to say that Lloyd had always thought outside the box and she believed in his abilities, but she really wondered if it was possible to put a train on such a narrow peak. The protagonist began to say that in any case it will be difficult. For this reason he will try to choose the most flat area. The queen accepted all the words of the guy and said that she intended to move on to another question. She asked how Lloyd plans to cross the land of demons which were on top of the mountain, and on this Lloyd began to smile, and then with the most confident look stated that he has a great plan. A while later Lloyd and Xavier were traveling at great speed on the dragon. The protagonist asked what Xavier knew about demons, and he said that he had only heard about them from legends. He said that demons lived on the ridge, and all he could add was that demons eat people, leaving the protagonist to think that he had wandered into a place that was not written about in the novel. The dragon continued to move at breakneck speed, while the boys seemed to see something right in front of them. It turned out they had arrived in the land of demons, which was called Credos. Xavier started talking about how it was not going to be easy for them and asked what Lloyd's plan was, while the protagonist started shouting madly that his plan was to invade. Xavier grinned at Lloyd while thinking about how cruel Lloyd was. The protagonist began to laugh, thinking that they had managed to defeat both demons and angels, and that these enemies would be defeated as well. Then the dragon began to spew a huge amount of flame, which instantly destroyed a section of the strong vortex, after which they were able to get inside at great speed. There they found themselves in a completely different climatic conditions. The protagonist thought that he expected from this place exactly something darker than what he now saw in front of his eyes, namely the incredibly beautiful fields that enveloped a vast tract of land. Xavier announced that he had seen a demon. While the demons themselves were very frightened, they started screaming that they had seen a human and started crying tears of fear. Lloyd started yelling at the little girl demon for crying at the sight of him, thinking it was because of his appearance. The demon children were screaming with all their might in fear as a terrifying dragon was approaching them at great speed. Lloyd, with a crazy look on his face, shouted to the children that they should not be afraid of him, because he just wants to ask them about some things. Such a scary look on his face even more frightened the children, who continued to have hysterics. Lloyd started yelling even more, because he was angry that the children kept running away from him. As Xavier looked at his mad master and wondered if the protagonist didn't realize the obvious, Xavier's gaze was suddenly drawn to a movement that he noticed. It turned out to be a demon that was approaching the guys at a great speed, with a clear intention to attack. Xavier instantly drew his blade, and then at a great speed, Xavier reported to Lloyd that they had just been attacked by an adult demon, and that the power of the enemy was at least at the level of a master swordsman. While the demon landed on the ground and watched the humans carefully assessing their strength, a huge dragon hovered over the demon. It looked incredibly huge, while Lloyd descended to the ground saying that he did not come to this place to fight. At that time, a huge number of other adult demons appeared behind the protagonist's back and were ready to attack instantly. Moments later, Xavier fended off all the attacks that were aimed in his direction. One of the demons stood against the guys and started talking. He said that they serve the demon lord and only protect this land. They introduced themselves as the 8 demon kings, and stood in a pose that was meant to show their greatness. Lloyd looked at these madmen with disdain. He started to say that there were too many of them because usually there are only 4 demon kings. One of the demons started shouting that the more of them they have, the more effective they can defend their lands. Then he started saying that humans should leave their lands immediately. The protagonist was incredibly angry that the demons had dared to call him a vile human, and it seemed he was beginning to turn into a creature much scarier than the demons. Xavier looked at his master, thinking that sometimes it was better to keep silent. The protagonist said that he had come to the demons to talk and asked to meet their leader. The demon girl started screaming that Lloyd had done terrible things to their children, while the protagonist started screaming that he hadn't done anything and asked the children what he had done. The children just started screaming and crying in fear. The adult demons instantly prepared to attack, thinking the protagonist was an evil man. Suddenly Lloyd began to chant, and the effect instantly worked on the demons, who were not expecting such a strong attack. Lloyd ordered Xavier to spring into action, whereupon Xavier instantly kicked everyone who tried to attack in the head, and the protagonist along with his servant were left standing over the newly defeated demons. Lloyd began to smile and talk about how they would finally be able to talk in peace. The girl was crying and trying to wake up the adults with the demon, while Lloyd looked at it carefully without expressing any emotion. The girl was crying because she was worried about her family, while the protagonist continued to stare coldly at the demon. The children cried and worried for their elders, and suddenly Lloyd realized that demons were actually good creatures, while Xavier added that the evil one was Lloyd himself. The girl cried and said that all humans were evil, and that they were afraid to go outside because all humans hated them. The protagonist listened to the girl saying that they came to their house to torture them. The protagonist began to think that demons for some reason are afraid of people, then realized that they were just hiding in this place. It turned out that demons survive by farming, and the words that they eat people were not true. Suddenly the main character's thoughts were interrupted by a female voice. It turned out to be a beautiful demonic girl, who claimed that they do eat people. She admitted that she is the queen of demons and is the head of the descendants of demons. Lloyd began to worry, because it seemed to him as if the demon queen had just read his mind. They were looking at an incredibly strong creature, whose strength was very difficult to measure. The little girl began to tell the queen that the humans had attacked them and she must punish them. Lloyd tried to justify himself, but realized that it would be pointless, while the queen refused the girl's request, which surprised the protagonist. The queen told the children that the people had just put the boys to sleep and that they had really just come to talk. The queen assumed that the people wanted to pass through their lands and suggested to discuss it in the castle. The protagonist was surprised by this outcome, and then he rode his dragon towards the demon castle. The protagonist pondered over a huge number of questions and did not know the answer to them, as suddenly the queen assumed that Lloyd has a lot of questions and told him to look to the right, where the guy saw an incredibly creepy statue. It turned out to be a statue of an ancient king of demons. She said that their ancestors really did eat people, and when they could not find food even ate their relatives. She said that they lived on lands where nothing grew and they had to attack people for food, and also that the demon king of the past changed everything by creating this place, and now they are the descendants of this place growing wheat, and also said that their resources are still limited. As they sat around the table, the girl suggested that Lloyd wanted to bring a trade route through their land. She began to say that it would be possible if they removed the barrier, but then they would lose their home and that was the reason they couldn't do it. Lloyd didn't understand why the demons couldn't just go to other lands where they could get more food. While the queen started talking about how people hate them because of the times when demons ate people, she talked about how people are afraid of them and wherever they appear there will be a fight. She also started talking about how it had been a long time since they had attacked humans, but the fear was still there. She started talking about how they have to pay for what they have done to people in the past. The queen began to cry and asked the hero from the other world to free them, while the protagonist said that he was not a hero at all, although he did come from the other world, but only a merchant who wanted to open a trade route. Lloyd offered to find a way for the demons to live outside, and the queen promised that they would remove the barrier and allow the trade route to be built. The protagonist thought deeply about how to prevent conflicts that might arise between humans and demons. He thought a lot, and suddenly the queen heard Lloyd's suggestion that she had already read his mind, and then said that the demons should pack their things, because their problem had already been solved. A little while later in the castle of the demon queen, the girl said that they would have to see if they could carry out Lloyd's plan. Lloyd looked at the girl carefully, and then he couldn't address her properly, because her full title sounded very long. Lloyd asked how far the girl could see people's thoughts, but she explained that she could not see people's thoughts, but could only look into the future for a short period of time. She told how their ancestor used this ability to grow wheat better. The protagonist was thinking about how amazing it was that the demon lord used to do weather forecasting just to farm. Suddenly, the protagonist's gaze became more serious, and then he immediately asked how far into the future the girl could see, which immediately disappointed the guy by saying that it was not as far as he needed. She told him that she could look into the future for a maximum of 24 hours. Lloyd was instantly curious about accidents and whether the girl could predict them. She looked at Lloyd in silence and then confessed that if the hero meant to restore fate, she could stop some accidents. Lloyd saw a ray of hope in the girl, for she could give him a little more time, and perhaps he could find a final solution to the matter. The queen began to say that this would only be possible when Lloyd freed her people. She began to say that they would not be able to convince the demons by force, and only when they chose a single representative would they be able to make such a decision. The protagonist was sure of himself. He was going to prove to these demons that beyond the barrier they could live just as well. A little while later, the weather was nice outside. A little girl was shaking with fear while Lloyd apologized to the child he had scared earlier. Lloyd looked fucking terrified and offered the kid a place to move. The girl got even more scared and started screaming and crying. Xavier called Lloyd a horrible person for scaring an innocent child, while Lloyd didn't realize what he was doing wrong. Xavier leaned over to the little girl and offered to go with him to see the world outside their settlement. The girl began to look confused. She didn't seem afraid of Xavier at all. Lloyd felt disgusted as Xavier's appearance continued to help him through life. A little while later they left the demon settlement on the dragon. The queen began to talk about how the girl was more afraid of humans than anyone else. She asked if the hero had heard the story of how demons came to their world, and Lloyd assumed it was just a rumor because there was no proof. She told him it wasn't a rumor, and added that they were free to cross the barrier. One day the girl got outside and looked at a family of people who were just about to have dinner. The family looked very happy. The girl did not understand why the adult demons called people bad. In fact, they looked very kind. The children were walking with a sword, as suddenly one of the children was hit on the head, then began to get angry. That made the girl who was secretly watching the children laugh. Cold weather came. It was snowing heavily, People were quite sad as the cold weather caused huge problems with food. At that time the girl looked at the father of the family, who just didn't know what to do. Then she started to run away in the direction of her house. Some time later people looked in a shocked expression towards the street, where stood a little girl demon with a basket of fruit in her hands. She offered people these fruits that would make their lives easier, as suddenly the woman began to shout with all her might that demons have arrived to them. This very much frightened and upset the girl. She saw people who ran away to their homes in a panic, because they were very afraid of her. While the man prepared to attack the little girl, she had time to look behind her back, and at the last moment to dodge the attack of this man. She was naturally very much frightened and began to run away from the evil man at great speed. A huge number of people went in pursuit of the girl. They hated her simply because she was a demon. They cornered the poor demonic girl and were going to kill this harmless child. She became angry at the way she was treated, and then she took on a completely different appearance which immediately scared the people who wanted to kill her. The girl in a moment thought about the words she had been told since she was a virgin, namely that they should never attack people. Then she got on all fours and started running away from the evil people at a great speed. She ran with all her might while the voices of the men were heard behind her back. The girl was crying, for she was very much offended at the way she was treated, for she was only trying to do good. In the present, they flew on a dragon, while Lloyd began to shed his tears, saying that it was too formulaic a story. As they flew, the hero talked about how it was time to end such stories. They were already near the protagonist's land, after which they descended to the ground and walked around Lloyd's domain. The girl was very much scared. She was afraid of people. While Lloyd said hello to the inhabitant of the place, the girl instantly closed her eyes out of fear, while the orc started talking about how he needed to dry off as he had overpumped his muscles. The girl's gaze instantly went blank while the orcs started walking away from the guys. The girl wondered and asked why there were demons walking around in the human settlement, while the queen told her it was the orcs. At that time the skeletons began to enthusiastically greet the protagonist, and seemed very happy for his arrival. While the girl watched all of this carefully, at that time, a huge dragon flew over them, complaining about missing the time to clean up. The girl turned to the protagonist. She assumed that the protagonist was also the Lord of Darkness, because he has the same scary face. Such words made the main character angry, who asked the girl what was wrong with his face. Thank you so much to everyone who watched it to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like and check out the other manhwa I've released on the channel, as it's really interesting. Thanks again. See you all soon. 날 보고 있으면 막 baby 너를 위한 melody yeah 네가 뮤지니까 잘 들어봐 play it